a video about the politics of privilege. The problem in the 21st century is not that people use the concept of privilege. It's not even that they overuse the concept of privilege. Let's admit it to ourselves. The term is getting worn out. It's getting tired. The problem is they proceed in an unexamined way to contrast privilege to something that is presumed to be its counterposed opposite. And what is the opposite of privilege? I have never driven a car in my whole entire life. Never once. I have had the privilege of living downtown. I have had the privilege of being a pedestrian where I could walk from my apartment to the gym. Is it such a great privilege? For one thing, you have to pay higher rent to be downtown. For another thing, you can see YouTube videos here on this channel of me walking in the freezing cold at 6 o'clock in the morning from my home to the gym. It's not always so easy or enjoyable being a pedestrian. Nevertheless, I'm completely willing to admit I have had the privilege of refusing to own a car, the privilege of refusing to drive a car. I do not think of myself as morally superior to those who drive cars. And I can also recognize there are some jobs where if I had been hired for the job, it would have been necessary for me to drive a car. Very briefly, I applied for jobs at bread factories. So that is being a baker, but in reality, it's at a huge scale where it's a factory process. You're operating machines. It's not like being a baker in your own kitchen. When I applied to work in bread factories, you might say, I was completely aware that if I got the job, if I were offered the job and I accepted the job, I absolutely would need to own a car. So yeah, there's an element of luck and there's an element of privilege in being able to refuse a car. I have never murdered anyone in my entire life. It may be said that I have had a privileged life because I have never been in the sort of circumstances that really would require me to kill someone. And, I've lived in some parts of the world like Cambodia and Laos where you can meet and talk to people who grew up in circumstances of ongoing civil war, tribalism, mercenary work, where it really was normal for people to have committed murder, killings, multiple times in their life growing up. Let's not digress into details, but yes, compared to, say, a member of a northeast Cambodian tribal group who lived through the Cambodian Civil War period, I have had the privilege of never having to engage in any kind of acts of killing, murder, civil war, neither in self-defense nor in a mercenary fashion, nor, neither working for the Communist Party nor against the Communist Party. In Cambodia, there were actually multiple communist parties fighting against each other. It's even more complex than that. Sure, just being born into a civilization with a high level of stability, peace, order, and good government, I have had the privilege of never really being cornered into that type of violence. But what are we counterposing to this privilege? I've had the privilege of being a pedestrian. I've had the privilege of never owning a car. In Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, city I used to live in, there were a whole lot of kids who received a car as their high school graduation gift. There are kids who started driving a car during high school. They received like a BMW. This is quite common in Victoria, a very expensive car as their graduation gift. And then they're driving a luxury vehicle, from the end of high school forward. Okay? We both have privilege. What about someone who chooses to have dramatically lower rent by not renting an apartment downtown? They rent an apartment in the suburbs. They may pay half as much in rent as I pay, but they then take on the responsibility and the annoyance of owning a car, paying for insurance on the car, having to pay for parking. Everyone likes to complain about paying for parking. They live a very different life. They pay half as much rent. They probably have a larger apartment. They live in kind of better conditions in various ways. They don't have to deal with the noise and crowding of being in a downtown part of the city, Victoria. They can't walk from their apartment to a gym. Maybe they have to drive, but they also have the privileges and advantages of driving a car. Okay. The problem is we can't simply counterpose privilege to the opposite of privilege because there is no opposite of privilege. The only thing that people are employing, and normally without being aware of it, is that they have some kind of unchallenged cultural assumption about what's normal, what's default, But that is in itself, in fact, just another set of privileges. It's just a more familiar set of privileges to them, to their specific subjective standpoint. Northeastern Cambodia, there are a lot of people who grow up inheriting rice land. They inherit a plot of land to grow rice on. And the plot of land they inherit seems to be the same size as everyone else's plot of rice land. So they're rice farmers. They live among rice farmers. The land is divided up into little squares, and it seems like everyone has a kind of equal amount of privilege. I'll tell you why in just a second. It's very easy for those people in their small town ignorance to look at university-educated people in the big city and complain, oh, they have all the privilege. Those big city people who are going and getting a university education, they have privilege, whereas we don't. In reality, there are just two different set of privileges here. There are many ways in which someone in the big city in Cambodia who goes to university and then probably can't get any better job than being a small town school teacher, teaching children in a small town school, that person probably lives a much more difficult and uncertain life compared to the rice farmer. And let's not forget, inheriting the ownership of farmland, that is privilege in the most fundamental medieval sense of the word privilege. This is privilege in a sense that hasn't changed since, the era of aristocrats and serfs as opposed to landowners. Now, very briefly, in Cambodia, they used to have a communist government. The communist government fell apart. When communism was failing, one of the stages of its failure was that the land that they had taken away from everyone to centralize under the ownership of the Communist Party, they privatized land ownership, and they distributed to people more or less equally. Yeah, you could put a footnote in here. You could add a lot of details, and of course there were a lot of conflicts that grew out of it. But nevertheless, you can go to many villages in Cambodia, still today, rural Cambodia, where the land was divided up into a bunch of squares and kind of each family got a plot of rice land. The fact that they may perceive that as a default, common, or normal privilege doesn't mean it's not a privilege. It's merely a type of privilege they are more familiar with. Australia, mining corporations. I met a guy who was a safety engineer in a mining corporation. And so you can imagine his job is a set of highly technical skills, checking that the air pressure is okay with this hose, checking that the water pressure is okay with this hose, checking the particulate matter in the air quality, checking that certain types of machines and devices are working properly mechanically, that they're still reliable. If you have a scale that measures weight, is the scale accurate? He works against a checklist of these things day by day. And these jobs, if you look at it step by step, each thing on the checklist, each one of those jobs could be done by a high school dropout with no university education. This guy I met, he had the privilege of going to university. I think he got a master's degree in mechanical engineering. If not, he got a master's degree in one of those practical sciences. And the bane of his existence was that these Australian mining corporations would hire people who were high school dropouts with no education, people who hadn't been through any of the struggle, made the effort he made. They would hire them just because their father or grandfather was an employee at the same mine, was an employee of the same mining corporation 40 years ago. Apparently this is common in Australia, according to this guy. There are a lot of companies that will hire people not based on merit, not based on education, but because of who their parents or grandparents were. So this is, again, privilege in a very medieval and feudal sense. This is an inherited title, right? And he complained to me that these kids grow up aware that they are guaranteed a high-paying job for life. So he said they're incredibly lazy in school. They drop out of high school as soon as they can at age 16 to go and work in the mine. He said that most of them are arrogant alcoholics. They start drinking and being reckless because they know from their childhood, because their father had this job, therefore they're guaranteed a good job at the mine. And of course, I think also he's aware, although he had the privilege of going to university and learning the kind of aspects of physics and chemistry and theoretical science that lurk behind the safety procedures, there's a level on which technically Any high school dropout can do the same job that he does. Anyone can be trained in 2 days or less to, use a little device to measure particulate matter in the air and then write it down. And then they're told, okay, if the value is above this amount, make a phone call and inform this person. The actual procedures they have to follow do not require an advanced university education. But both sides, each perceives the other as privileged. The high school dropout has resentment against the university boy. Oh, you think you're better than me because you got an education, you went to university, you had all this privilege going and studying physics and chemistry and mechanical engineering in a university in the big city. And on the other side, that guy is saying from his perspective, yeah, he went to university, he probably has student debt, he probably had to live in a tiny apartment as a student for years, doing this boring, repetitive work, learning chemistry or whatever. He feels he had to work really hard to get this job, as opposed to this kid who has privilege. You dropped out of high school, you didn't suffer through years of education that I suffered through, you're handed this job just because of who your father or grandfather was. Each side perceives the other as having privilege. And the fundamental point I'm trying to get across here is that is correct. All right? The opposite of privilege is just a different set of privileges. Whatever it is you perceive as no privilege at all, it's just a set of privileges that's more exotic to you, that you are less familiar with subjectively. Okay? So the ultimate absurdity this comes down to is meat eaters complaining that vegans have privilege. And again, there's no point denying it. The same way that a pedestrian has certain privileges. Okay, I choose to rent an apartment downtown and pay more rent so I can walk to the gym instead of having to drive a car to get to the gym. Someone else pays half as much rent, but they have to drive a car to get to the gym, and then they have to pay for parking. So it's different in terms of the costs involved. Likewise, yes, there is a set of privileges involved in choosing to eat a vegan diet. But there's also an unbelievable number of privileges involved in eating a beef-based diet or a fish-based diet. You have the privilege of buying this product wrapped in plastic that's been rendered unto you by this unbelievable corporate and government structure that includes, all the safety and quality control, so on and so forth. You get to you have the ultimate, amassing of first world privilege in making meat something you can, so easily access and consume. And let's face it, guys, at the end of the day, eating meat is actually more expensive. I mean, it's harder for me to say that even about car ownership. If I had accepted a job working at a bakery where I needed to get up in the morning and drive my car to the bakery at 3 a.m., because bakeries open really early, I couldn't really look at it and say, well, gee, owning a car is a privilege. I wouldn't have the option of living without a car. The cost of owning a car is necessary for the money that I earn. That's true for many jobs. And that's why I don't feel morally superior to people who do own cars or people who do drive cars. Okay? But as a matter of fact, it's more expensive to eat beef. It's more expensive to eat shrimp. It's more expensive to eat cheese. And it's cheaper to eat lentils. It's cheaper to eat a diet that eliminates those things. So ultimately, yes, in that case, you can simply measure which privilege is more economically inefficient. Okay, guys, I think this is a great example of a kind of rhetorical device that's currently dominant in discussions of 21st century politics. It's a big deal on the left. It's a big deal on the right also. And it fundamentally cannot last. I think just a few years from now, people will look back and joke, remember when everyone was talking about privilege? The fundamental thing you have to practice in order to diffuse meaningless, hostile, counterproductive conversations about privilege is this. You have to remind people that the opposite of privilege is not the absence of privilege. It's just a different set of slightly less familiar privileges that also deserve to be examined, analyzed, and understood.